Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Andy Grammer, called The Good Parts. So, for some bizarre reason, my most viewed video at this point on my channel is my top 10 best hit songs of 2015. And to be honest, I'm not really a huge fan of that video. There are gratuitous editing mistakes that make me cringe every single time I go back to it. But I guess controversy sells because there were some eclectic and loaded picks on that list. And while my number one choice probably triggered the most controversy, one of the other entries was just as inflammatory. Honey, I'm Good by Andy Grammer, a top 10 hit that a lot of critics hated, especially for its cloying, rather tough to watch music video. And yet, I never really did, and it's hard not to feel like a lot of people miss the point of that song, mostly because Andy Grammer is a pop artist from a different time. If he had broken through in the 50s or early 60s, I can imagine him being far more successful for his unabashed cheerfulness and sincerity, which our more cynical time tends to view as a mask or more inauthentic, which they then projected onto this song. Hell, I've said much of the same thing about many of the acts that have hopped on the retro pop trend in the past couple of years, but you know what, I've gone back to hear Andy Grammer's albums, and this actually feels authentic and not a studio calculation. That's who he is. If a little bit over earnest and corny, that's genuine. It makes kind of sense when you hear that his father made a lot of music for children. It was actually nominated for a Grammy in that category in 2005, which also probably explains how Andy Grammer got the connections and the traction opening up for, say, the Plain White T's or Natasha Bedingfield or Colby Calais. Basically some of the whitest, least threatening artists in modern music of the past decade. Hell, his list of inspirations include Jason Mraz, Jack Johnson, Coldplay, One Republic, and The Fray. Now, his first album in 2011, it actually did have a single that hit the bottom half of the Hot 100, but it was his second album, Magazines and Novels, that really took off. Because after a failed single that was co-written with a member of AJR, and no, I'm not kidding about that, he released Honey, I'm Good, and it broke into the top 10. And yet, even in 2015, I'm not really sure if Andy Grammer could have sustained a longer career on the Hot 100. He was defiantly uncool, and his follow-up single over a year later was Fresh Eyes, and that was the lead-off single for this album, which was a year ago. A song I mostly liked but didn't love, and yet it was intended as a charity single, so don't you all feel bad now. And thus, I was kind of worried that it took over a year for this new album to drop, and only now in December. Not a good sign, especially coming from his label. But on the other hand, there's a song from Lunch Money Lewis on this list. I can't get that mad at it, right? So, how did the good parts turn out? Well, look folks, I'm a little bit at a loss for this one. For one, as much as I have praised Honey, I'm Good and defended Andy Grammer going into this, all of that was conditional on the songs actually being there to back him up. And with the good parts, it became a hell of a lot harder for me to really say that. But it's also the sort of record that I rarely ever cover on my show in this vein, where I'd be inclined to make a Hoodie Allen comparison for as shamelessly polished and inoffensive and white as this is, except I get the impression that the audience that would love this record would probably consider Hoodie Allen way too edgy. Maybe the most recent Train record would be a better parallel, and that's not exactly a good thing either. In short, The Good Parts is a record that at its best builds its charm off of guileless earnestness, and yet at worst can tread into cloying territory that has me looking for the exits. And frankly, there was a lot more of the latter. And that needs to be stressed right out of the gate. If you're looking for a pop star who's bringing nuance or subtlety to the table, even despite his slightly more low-key delivery this time around, Andy Grammer, he's not your guy. And on previous records, that wasn't really an issue. He doesn't exactly need a lot of dimension in order to be kind of charming, or at least a little bit of a likable presence if he has that charisma. But the problem with an approach like this is that if there are notes of ambiguity that are not handled well, it can really strike a sour note, and that happens a fair bit more often than it should on this album. Take the title track, where Andy Grammer wants to know all the little insecurities and weaknesses of his partner so we can see the whole picture and love her beyond the mask that she might put forward. Not exactly a bad intention, but his language is so brusque in the opening verse that it doesn't really take into the consideration any sort of nuance, that revealing that sort of thing for her could be difficult or require patience on her part. Or take Working on It, a song about people getting over their vices to be better, like, say, smoking. But then it frames in the second verse a girl sleeping around as a vice, and it goes right up to the line of slut-shaming with all the best of intentions. Lovely. Hell, the more you listen to this album, the more you get the impression that Andy Grammer doesn't really grasp elements of the world that fall outside his clearly delineated worldview and sense of ethics. Or for songs like Civil War, or the hookup that he falls into but doesn't really like on This Ain't Love, even his own human vices which he actively wants to banish. But on the flip side, Then you get the absolutely excruciating song Grown Ass Man Child, which seemed at first to be a parody of swaggering meat-headed machismo as kind of childish, and then when you listen to the second verse where Andy Grammer emphasizes his maturity and how grounded he is, you get the horrifying feeling that he's kind of playing it straight. And sometimes it's just a wonky choice of language, like how parts of Spaceship are coached through hip-hop drug cooking language when it's about his as-of-then unborn daughter, which he then serenades on Always, which aside from cribbing chunks of its melody from Thinking Out Loud, uses language that feels entirely inappropriate for that sort of relationship. It's a little bit creepy and it shouldn't be. And what's stunning is that you can tell that he's not intending to be subversive or adding nuance. Again, there's a ton of sincerity. He believes what he's selling, and yet it just comes across as awkward at best and really kind of cringy and awful at worst. Now look, that's not saying that there aren't some moments that have some charm. Fresh Eyes, it hasn't really grown on me, but it is one of the best hooks here, courtesy of Andy Grammer actually underplaying his vocals. 85, it's a scold against materialism, but at least it has some momentum beyond some of the bragging. And while his closing collaboration with Lunch Money Lewis is painfully simplistic, it is basically harmless. I don't mind it. But that leads to the production, where harmless is arguably the most flattering descriptor that I could use for it. Going back to Honey, I'm Good again, one reason why that song connected so well was that the old-fashioned idea was played with old-fashioned compositional sensibilities, and that's definitely not the case here. Instead, Andy Grammer has sought to modernize a lot of the tones and composition on this album with acoustic guitars, piano and organ, and beats that range from more of a tropical bounce to more trap-flavored skitters and Chainsmokers inspired drops, the latter of which gets particularly obnoxious on the chiptune elements of Grown Ass Man Child. Again, that song is horrible. And while this could conceivably be a good idea, we immediately run to the issue how so few of these songs contain a prominent melodic progression near the front of the mix outside of the vocal line, with brittle acoustic grooves and thicker percussion tending to overpower any melody you do get, with the only real saving grace being some bass lines that tend to be a little bit more developed than you would otherwise expect. There is some groove to this, and none of it has much texture or bite or unique character that you wouldn't have heard in the most generic pop imaginable, all with the sort of pristine polish and closeness to the front of the mix that betrays any sorts of depth or subtlety. Ultimately, just feels like a flimsy sort of late period Maroon 5 sort of vein, which really is not a good fit for Andy Grammer's slightly more nasal vocal tone, which could probably use more texture to back it up. Now, when this album does build some more momentum, it can kind of get around these shortcomings. The rubbery bounce on 85, it definitely helps. As to the slightly faded keys playing off the more dense percussion on Working On It, but more often than not, that's yet another dimension that was just sacrificed on the altar for this album. But as a whole, look, I'll freely admit this is targeted at a very different pop audience than where I personally like and fall. Maybe a little bit more of a demographic that's a little more settled or conservative or family friendly or risk averse than I am. And as I have said from the very beginning, if the writing and the tunes were good, that would have been fine. It could have surpassed that. The problem is, they really aren't, and Andy Grammer's earnest wholesomeness can start to curdle when confronted with the necessary reality of human emotions and failings outside of his own, and that can make his lack of dimensionality a lot tougher to stomach. And when you don't have those stronger songs to make up for the sheer grating awfulness of songs like Grown Ass Man Child, no, I'm sorry, this didn't pass for me. I'm giving it a strong 4 out of 10, and I really can't recommend it. Maybe if you find acts like Hoodie Allen or Maroon 5 too edgy, or acts like Ed Sheeran or Ben Rector too rootsy or challenging, you might like this. But if that's the case, we have very different definitions on what we would consider quality music. And for everybody else, yeah, you can probably skip it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. You'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Guys, look, I want to like this. I've defended this guy before. I put him on a year-end list, for God's sakes. But this was really mediocre. It just fell flat in its face way too many times. But if you want to buy it, links in the description below. Got the poll up there for you all to tell me how wrong I am. Happy to see all that in the comments below. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in supporting my channel or potentially have any sort of impact on my schedule, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. Running out of time for this end of the year, so if you want to get your albums voted up the schedule, you might want to get on board pretty fast. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.